I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Senator John Cornyn discussed the bipartisan gun deal unveiled over the weekend on the Senate floor Tuesday. The proposal includes strengthening background checks and boosting red flag laws. The Texas lawmaker directly stated that, quote, "None of what we are proposing would create a national red flag law." Last week, congressional Republicans claimed that these measures would strip Americans of due process, but Democrats argued that they are necessary in curbing gun violence. Listen in for Cornyn's explanation.
Mr. President, I want to report that we are making serious progress in our bipartisan effort to respond to the shooting in Uvalde, Texas, and other places around the country. Over the last few weeks, I've been working in particular with Senator Murphy, Senator Sinema, and Senator Tillis on mental health and school safety reforms. And we've narrowed the scope of our discussions to provisions that we believe can earn broad bipartisan support in the Senate. And a number of our colleagues on both sides have joined the discussion. Over the weekend, we announced an agreement on principles for bipartisan legislation. 20 senators, 10 Republicans, and 10 Democrats. This included a range of targeted reforms to keep our children and our communities safe, from mental health resources to funding to harden schools and make them more safe. No parent should have to send their child to school wondering whether they're going to be safe at school, and certainly no student should be afraid to go to school for fear of their safety. We also included a number of targeted measures to prevent violence by people committing crimes and other dangerous individuals. I'm proud of the work we've done so far, but of course, we're not at the finish line. We are still at the beginning when it comes to drafting appropriate text. Our agreement is based on principles alone, and translating this proposal into legislative language is no easy task, as members of the Senate understand. Here's an example of the many details that need to be ironed out. One of the big pieces of this bill relates to state crisis intervention programs and initiative. The idea here is pretty simple: support programs that reduce violence, protect the public, and help individuals in crisis get the help they need. But there are a number of different ways this provision could be drafted, and I'm committed to ensuring we get it done right. But I want to be clear, because there's been a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding on this point. None of what we are proposing would create a national red flag law. No national red flag law. Some have mischaracterized this provision as an incentive for states to pass a red flag law, but that's something I'm aiming to avoid. I trust the states to make their own decisions, and 16 states have decided to pass red flag laws. But that's fewer than half of the states with red flag laws on the books. Congress should not only send federal funding to those states, but also other states that are doing things to deal with people in crisis. And as the agreement in principle said, what we're focused on is crisis intervention. But there are a number of different ways that this could be approached, and I'm fighting for this proposal to include a grant program that gives every state, regardless of whether it has a red flag law or not, funding to administer programs that they do have that will reduce violence, increase public safety, and make sure that individuals in crisis get the help that they need. There should be no requirement for states that do not currently have a red flag law to pass one. The existence or lack of a red flag law should not impact on any state's ability to receive funds for crisis intervention. And if a state does want to use this money to implement a red flag law, they should not be able to do so unless their red flag law contains a full set of due process and Bill of Rights protections in the Constitution. So how could states without red flag laws use this money? Well, there are a range of evidence-based programs that support our shared goal, which is, in fact, to keep some communities safe and to save lives. One great example is the assisted outpatient treatment programs. These are sometimes just called AOTs. These programs allow courts to order people with serious mental illness to receive outpatient treatment as a condition of living in the community. AOTs can be life-changing for people who struggle to maintain consistent mental health treatment. Programs vary from state to state, but typically include medication, along with a variety of other services, including counseling. AOTs rely on evidence-based treatment plans to help individuals live healthier, safer lives, and they have a successful track record. Assisted outpatient treatment programs are effective in reducing arrests and incarceration, violent mental crises, and hospital stays and homelessness. I think this is another way that states without red flag laws might be able to use the funding that we would provide under the provisions of this bill. At least that's what I'm hoping we ultimately land on. I think it would be kind of strange if we passed a national law that said only 16 states were going to be eligible for this money, and you'd only be eligible for it if you passed a red flag law. I think that would almost be like trying to commandeer the state's legislature and government and force them to accept something that they've decided not to do. But because maybe they've tried to do something a little bit differently, like assisted outpatient treatment, mental health courts, which have been very successful in my state, and veterans courts, in particular to focus on our veterans community who have particular challenges. While I'm talking about assisted outpatient treatment, 47 states actually have those laws, and I would like the money that would be available under this fund for crisis intervention to be able to be used for that. Again, I don't support any prescriptive mandates or national mandates at all, including a national red flag. Each state should be able to make their own choices and use its share of funding in the best way it sees fit to protect the constitutional rights of somebody who is in mental health crisis, or to provide other resources like assisted outpatient treatment or mental health court adjudications or veterans courts hearings in order to help them address their challenges. The great thing about the design of our country is that we have a national government, but we have sovereign states. Louis Brandeis once called them the laboratories of democracy. And actually, it makes plenty of sense to me that we learn from the experience of the states that have passed red flag laws and states that have passed other types of ways to address people requiring crisis intervention. This provides the ability to innovate and to try new ideas and to come up with best practices that the federal government simply cannot do when you're considering legislating for a country of 330 million people. So I personally do not support an overly prescriptive grant program that favors only a few states over all 50 states. And of course, I won't support any grant program that violates the Constitution or the requirement of due process of law when it comes to a constitutional right like the Second Amendment. So I do believe there are a range of options to improve public safety, and the states should have the funding and flexibility to invest in programs that they think best delivers the result, to save lives, to help people in crisis, and that's really what we're trying to do with this legislation. So the details are still being worked out, Mr. President, and we're drafting legislative text, and of course, that's sometimes hard. Sometimes I've found that people use the same word and they mean something differently by it, or they come to it with a sort of context that maybe isn't apparent from a conversation about principles. And that's why going from the principles that 20 of us have agreed on into legislative text that we can then vote on and pass is a challenge. We know that on a sensitive topic like this, a single word or the placement of a comma can make the difference between protecting and infringing on rights. So I'm laser focused on drafting text that reflects the common sense targeted proposal that we've agreed to in principle. Again, we're working through the details, and I hope we will have legislative text later this week. But I'm not willing to rush it for the sake of speed. I spoke with Senator Schumer, the majority leader, this morning, and he said he'd like to have this bill ready to vote on next week. And I'm certainly with him in terms of that aspirational goal. That means we're going to have to complete our work on the text by the end of this week, so Senator Schumer will have that legislation available to take up next week. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I'd note the absence of quorum. Oh. All the quorum.